Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some really fascinating history today, the connections between African and Native American peoples.
Definitely a topic that deserves more attention.
Right. And we're going to be exploring this using excerpts from Africans and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes. This book really digs deep into some often overlooked connections.
Oh yeah, Forbes challenges a lot of assumptions about race and history in this book.
Exactly. Get ready to have your mind blown a little bit because we're not just talking about interactions in the Americas.
No, this goes way beyond that.
Think transcontinental connections, potentially even before Columbus. Pretty wild stuff.
You know, one of the things Forbes really emphasizes is how much our usual focus on European colonialism has kind of obscured these other relationships.
It's like we're missing huge chunks of the picture, right?
Absolutely. It's like
Yeah.
we're only seeing one tiny piece of a giant puzzle.
And one of the first things that jumped out at me from the book was how much we get stuck in this black-white way of thinking about race.
Yeah, that binary thinking really limits our understanding of how diverse these interactions were, especially when you look at Africans and Native Americans.
Yeah, it wasn't just a shared experience of oppression.
No, not at all. These relationships were complex, constantly evolving, alliances, conflicts, cultural exchanges, the whole spectrum of human interaction.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the most intriguing parts of the excerpt, where Forbes presents evidence for possible pre-Columbian contact across the Atlantic. Voyages before Columbus. That just seems crazy, right?
It definitely challenges our assumptions about who was sailing where and when. Like,
Yeah.
how is that even possible?
I know. So Forbes mentions Columbus himself claiming to have heard stories of Native Americans reaching the Azores.
Interesting.
Then you've got the Canary Islands, where some of the indigenous cultures had similarities to Native American groups.
I see where this is going.
And get this, there are even accounts of Portuguese sailors encountering canoes, like serious ocean-going canoes off the coast of West Africa. Can you imagine?
I mean, while we don't have conclusive proof of frequent voyages, these examples really make you wonder, right? What if there's more to the story than we've been told?
Right. It's like history is full of these little mysteries just waiting to be uncovered.
Absolutely. And on that note, the excerpt also brings to light the large-scale enslavement and transportation of Native Americans to both Europe and Africa, starting in the 1500s. It's something that often gets overlooked.
It's a stark reminder that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just about Africans. Forbes mentions some Native American slaves in Lisbon ending up as water sellers, interacting daily with African and Muslim slaves. That had to be a wild mix of cultures.
It really was a melting pot. And others were taken to the Netherlands. Some even learned to speak Dutch. Their presence, however brief, definitely left a mark.
You can see traces of potential Native American influence in things like horticultural practices in Europe. It's like this ripple effect across continents and time.
It makes you realize that Native Americans weren't just on the receiving end of European influence. They were actively shaping things in ways we're only beginning to understand.
We're sure. But one thing that makes piecing together this history so tricky is how terms like Negro, mulatto, and Indian have shifted in meaning over time.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't the fixed categories we think of today.
So Forbes breaks down how Negro was used for all sorts of non-white groups, South Asians, Native Americans, even sometimes Europeans. Crazy, right?
It was a very different time, different understanding of race. It highlights how these terms were often used to solidify power dynamics and racial attitudes.
Right, it wasn't about biological reality, but about how those in power categorized and controlled others. And it's wild, the examples Forbes uses. In Brazil, Jesuit priests used negros da terra, meaning blacks of the land, to refer to Native Americans.
To distinguish them from the Negros de Guinea, the blacks of Guinea.
Right, like, whoa, that's kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It shows how relative these terms were, not just about skin color, but who they were compared to. It makes you think about how much our modern ideas about race affect how we see the past.
Totally. And then there are these colonial Virginia legal documents where the same individual is listed as both Indian and Negro in different years.
Oh, wow, that's confusing.
It really makes you question, like, how much of our own modern ideas about race are we projecting onto the past?
It's a good point. Always important to keep that in mind.
Okay, so let's dive into the term mulatto. Initially, it just meant hybrid, but eventually it came to refer specifically to people of mixed African and Native American descent.
Right, a much more specific meaning developed over time. This shift reflects the realities for many enslaved people in the Americas.
Yeah.
Skewed gender ratios among the enslaved populations meant there was a lot of intermixing between Africans and Native Americans.
So the lines between those groups were much blurrier than we often imagine.
Much blurrier, yeah.
Yeah.
Not so clear-cut.
And Forbes uses some really vivid quotes to illustrate this. There's this 1541 Spanish decree that's all worried about African slaves taking Native American women as concubines. And then another document that refers to the children of Africans and Native Americans as mulattoes, even noting that some of them held skilled jobs.
It paints a picture of a society where interracial relationships were common, but also where racial categories were becoming more rigid, often working against those of mixed heritage.
Yeah, it's sad how the term mulatto often served to erase the Native American heritage of those individuals, like their history and experiences were being obscured.
It's crucial to remember that these historical categories weren't neutral. They were often used to solidify racial hierarchies and justify the exploitation of those considered other.
This deep dive is making me rethink so much of what I thought I knew about race and history, but I gotta admit, it's also a bit overwhelming. Where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, first, I think acknowledging that discomfort is important. Recognizing the limitations of our current understandings of race in history is the first step towards a more inclusive perspective. And second, I think we need to be open to questioning the narratives we've been taught. Look beyond the dominant perspectives and seek out the voices and stories that have been marginalized or silenced.
That reminds me of those pre-Columbian contact theories we were discussing earlier. Just because something isn't widely accepted doesn't mean it's not worth exploring. We have to be open to new possibilities, new ways of understanding the past.
Exactly. And that's what's so compelling about Forbes's work. He encourages critical thinking, challenges assumptions, and embraces the complexity of history. It's not about finding easy answers, but about understanding the nuances and contradictions of the past.
And those nuances include how racial categories were used to create a hierarchy, right? Forbes doesn't shy away from discussing how terms like mulatto, mestizo, and zambo were used to solidify a racial caste system in the Americas.
Yeah. It's a sobering reminder that these categories weren't just descriptive. They were tools of power used to justify slavery exploitation and social hierarchy. They reinforce this us versus them mentality with devastating consequences for generations.
And it wasn't just about physical appearance, was it? Forbes points out how these racial categories were also tied to social status, cultural practices,
Yeah.
and even religious beliefs. It was a whole web of interconnected factors that determined where someone fell on the social ladder.
And what's striking is how these categories became internalized, shaping people's sense of self and belonging. It wasn't just external pressure, it was also about how people saw themselves and their place in the world.
Yeah, I was struck by how Forbes highlights the diversity of experiences within these racial categories. He mentions how some mulattoes held skilled jobs while others were relegated to the lowest rungs of society. It's a reminder that these labels didn't tell the whole story. Individual lives were much more complex and nuanced.
Absolutely. It's crucial to resist the urge to stereotype, to remember that these groups were made up of individuals with their own unique stories, hopes, and dreams. People who navigated rigid social structures in their own ways, creating families, communities, and cultures that defied easy categorization.
Forbes really paints a vivid picture of this time period by weaving together so many different sources, legal documents, personal accounts, primary sources. It gives you a real sense of the depth and breadth of his research.
What's impressive is how he presents this complex information in an accessible and engaging way. He doesn't shy away from difficult questions, but he also offers insights that illuminate the human stories behind the historical facts.
One of the things that stood out to me was how fluid these racial categories were, especially in the early colonial period. It wasn't always clear-cut who was considered Indian, Negro, or mulatto.
Right. The lines were often blurred, particularly in areas with high rates of intermixing. People's racial classifications could even change over time, depending on their social context, economic status, or even personal relationships. It challenges this whole idea that race is this fixed and immutable category.
Forbes gives this example of a legal case in Virginia where an individual is listed as Indian in one year and then Negro in another. It really underscores how arbitrary these classifications were and how much they were influenced by social factors rather than any kind of biological realities.
And it's a reminder that these categories were often used strategically, both by individuals navigating the system and by those in power seeking to maintain control. It was a constant negotiation of identity within a system designed to limit and define people based on their perceived race.
It's fascinating how this topic connects to present-day issues. We still grapple with the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and racial categorization. These issues are so deeply embedded in our institutions and cultural understandings of race and identity.
It's like we're still living in the shadow of these historical forces. The terms may have changed, but the underlying dynamics of power and inequality persist. We see it in the ongoing struggles for racial justice, in the debates over immigration, and in the ways that race continues to shape people's lives and opportunities.
I was particularly struck by Forbes' discussion of how the U.S. Census has historically categorized and counted people of mixed race. It's a clear example of how seemingly objective categories are actually deeply subjective and reflect changing social and political agendas.
The census is a fascinating case study in how racial classifications are not neutral or objective. They are products of their time, reflecting prevailing social norms, political anxieties, and even scientific theories about race. And these classifications have real-world consequences, shaping everything from political representation to access to resources.
Forbes mentions how in 1890, the census used black to categorize anyone with 3/4 or more black blood, while in 1910, it shifted to using black only for full-blooded Negroes, leaving the definition of who was Indian up to the individual census enumerator.
It's almost comical how arbitrary these distinctions seem.
It really speaks to the absurdity of trying to quantify and categorize something as complex and fluid as race. And yet these seemingly minor bureaucratic decisions had a profound impact on how people were perceived, treated, and counted in society. It's a reminder that data is never neutral. It's always shaped by human choices and interpretations.
And those choices and interpretations are often rooted in power dynamics and social biases. Forbes highlights how the census has often erased or obscured the Native American heritage of people with mixed African and Native American ancestry. It's like their identities were being squeezed into a binary system that didn't accurately reflect their lived experiences.
It exemplifies how dominant narratives can shape the way we collect and interpret information, perpetuating existing inequalities by rendering certain groups invisible or marginalized. This brings to mind the concept of blood quantum, which is this idea that you need a certain percentage of Indian blood to be considered a member of a tribe. Forbes points out that it's a completely arbitrary measure with no basis in Native American traditions or cultural understandings of kinship and belonging.
It's a prime example of how colonial thinking has been imposed on Native American communities. Blood quantum was a tool of assimilation and control, designed to break up tribal lands, undermine sovereignty, and ultimately erase Native American identities.
And it's still used today by many tribal governments. Despite being widely criticized as a racist and arbitrary system, it's a stark reminder of how the past continues to shape the present in often invisible and insidious ways.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the past isn't really past.
Hmm.
It shapes our present in ways we may not even realize. And it's our responsibility to confront those legacies, unearth the hidden histories, and work towards a more just and equitable future.
This deep dive has really shown how we need to carefully analyze historical records, especially when it comes to race. We can't just take those categories at face value.
Sure.
We have to understand, the social and political context in which they were created and used.
It's like we're historical detectives,
Yeah.
piecing together evidence from the past to see how these categories were formed, how they were manipulated, and how they still influence our understanding of race and identity today. It requires constant questioning, reinterpretation, and critical analysis.
It's challenging work for sure, but it's crucial if we want to move beyond these simplistic understandings of race and history. We need to embrace the complexity, challenge assumptions, and listen to the voices that have been marginalized or silenced.
That's where the real power of Forbes's work lies. It's not just about uncovering hidden histories. It's about motivating us to rethink our understanding of race identity and our shared human story. It's about understanding how our past and present are intertwined and using that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future.
So what does all this mean for us today? For one thing, I think it means being more conscious of the language we use when talking about race. We have to recognize that these categories are fluid, contested, and often carry a legacy of oppression and inequality.
Definitely. And we have to be more critical of the narratives we've been taught about race and history. We need to seek out alternative perspectives, challenge dominant assumptions, and embrace the complexities and contradictions of the past. It's not about erasing history, but about understanding it in all its messiness.
It also means acknowledging how these historical forces continue to affect us today. We see it in the struggles for racial justice, the debates about immigration, and how race still impacts people's lives and opportunities.
Yeah. The fight for racial equality isn't a relic of the past. It's an ongoing struggle that demands we understand the deep historical roots of racial inequality and challenge the systems and structures that perpetuate it.
Forbes provides us with a path forward. He encourages us to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and be open to new interpretations of the past. It's a journey of discovery that can be both challenging and rewarding.
It's about embracing the unknown, acknowledging the limitations of our current understanding, and being willing to adjust our perspectives on history as we learn more. It's about being comfortable with ambiguity and realizing that there aren't simple answers when it comes to race and identity.
One point that really struck me was how the presence of Native Americans in Europe and Africa might have contributed to local cultures.
Yeah, it's not something you hear very often.
Right. Imagine knowledge and techniques developed over centuries in the Americas making their way across the Atlantic and potentially shaping things like agriculture in Europe.
It really broadens our perspective on history.
It highlights how interconnected human history truly is. It wasn't just about Europeans discovering and civilizing the rest of the world. It was a dynamic process of exchange and influence.
Yeah, two-way street.
One of the key takeaways for me from this deep dive is the importance of recognizing the agency and contributions of groups that have often been marginalized or erased from history. Native Americans weren't just passive recipients of European colonialism.
Absolutely.
They actively shaped the world we live in today.
And those untold stories often challenge the simplified narratives we've been given. They make us question assumptions, consider different perspectives, and embrace the complexities of the past.
This deep dive has really gotten me thinking differently about race. Forbes demonstrates how these categories are fluid, contested, and ultimately social constructs, not biological realities.
That's a crucial insight. Race isn't inherent or fixed. It's something societies create, define, and redefine for specific purposes. And those purposes often involve power hierarchy and control.
And those constructs have very real consequences. They shape how we view ourselves and others and how we interact with the world.
Absolutely.
They can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and even violence.
Which is why it's vital to critically examine these categories, understand their historical roots, and challenge how they continue to shape our lives and society.
Yeah.
It's not about ignoring race, but about understanding it in a more nuanced and informed way.
Part of that understanding is recognizing the diverse experiences within these racial categories. People's lives and identities are far more complex than any label can capture.
We can't essentialize or stereotype entire groups of people based on their perceived race. Every individual has unique story experiences that shape who they are, and those stories deserve to be heard and respected.
As we wrap up, I'm struck by how much this discussion has challenged my own preconceptions about history and race. It's highlighted how much I still have to learn and unlearn, and the importance of continually questioning and exploring.
That's the beauty of history. It's a constant process of discovery, learning, and growth. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know.
It's humbling, but also incredibly liberating.
Yeah, it frees us from those simplistic narratives and opens up a world of possibilities.
So let's hold on to that sense of wonder, curiosity, and willingness to challenge ourselves. Let's keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep uncovering the hidden stories that make up our shared human past.
Who knows what amazing discoveries await us? What other incredible connections and insights are waiting to be revealed? It's an exciting prospect.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's ignited your own curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring the intricacies of history and race. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of your understanding.